ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast welcomes Catherine Engelbrecht, founder of True the Vote, and today's topic, fixing our broken election system. Catherine Engelbrecht, thank you for joining us on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Would you tell us about True the Vote, what your mission is, and how you got started?
True the Vote's mission is to empower citizens to take a stand for trustworthy elections. And we started in 2009, quite by accident. I came from an oil and gas manufacturing background. I had no stake in politics or even elections for that matter. And what happened really began with my very first experience working in the polls and seeing problems that I thought could be attributed to just bad process, and decided to look more deeply. That looking turned into a national organization that almost 15 years later, has now, I think, I look back in the rearview mirror of everything that's happened, and there's been many an adventure over the years in trying to understand why our elections are in the state that they are in. And I believe it's frankly all come to 2024. I believe it is all about what we are facing in these next few months. So time will tell, but we are trying to wake people up about the importance, not just of voting, but of serving in our elections and taking a stand.
You know, Catherine, you mentioned empowering citizens, and the unfortunate thing is so many people feel powerless in this process. So what encouragement do you have for citizens as far as regaining some power over the process?
Well, first, I get it, and I can appreciate it. It's sometimes very overwhelming, and even I feel sometimes just like, how have we fallen so far? But the fact is, and it may be a brutal fact, but a fact nonetheless, the only way we make up this lost ground is to work our way out of it. Sitting on the sidelines and hoping that something changes that's not a winning strategy. The only way forward is to put our boots on and gird up and go. With that, then, things can happen very, very quickly. And it's one of the reasons that we introduced a new program called Scan, Check, Protect, just to show people how their involvement just on a one person process can make such an impact. And what we did with that is help people that have moved around the country see for themselves that once you move out of a state, in all likelihood, you're going to remain registered in that state until you go back and physically remove yourself, notify the Secretary of State to remove you. Otherwise, your registration stays there. And so that's one example of just something that any single person can do. And with that, we are finding that eyes are opened and people are more engaged in saying, okay, I get that. I see the problem. Now what can I do? And that's what we need is if everybody just does a little bit, we're going to be okay.
It seems to me that there was a recent case where a state was actually trying to clean up its voter rolls. In fact, it might have been here in Virginia, and inadvertently made a mistake and took some people off it shouldn't have. So do we have systems in place that are working properly at the state level to make sure the voter rolls are clean?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we have to start with the premise of why are our voter rolls as messed up as they are when in the rest of our daily lives. And, we live in a culture that is very data centric, where there is a whole market for surveillance capitalism, and that data is accurate. So like it or not, there's a private industry of data around us that makes sure that our goods and services can be delivered to us by drone within 2 hours. Yes. We have achieved that. So why is it then that our voter rolls are in such a mess? And that gets back to laws that were written in the early 90s, guidance and standards that were written well before, the internet age, and are lagging. And so, no, the states do not have, and I can't really name a single state that I would hold up as an exemplar for best process in making sure their data rolls or their voter rolls are well maintained. Not that the technology doesn't exist, not that the data doesn't exist. I just can't point to a single example of a state doing it at a top level type standard. That said, when states do attempt to clean up their rolls, they are going to get some wrong. And I think that gets to just where we are as a culture. If you get some wrong, all that takes is a notification and it's easy to clear up. But if you get 97% right, the 3% should be able to be dealt with, re-adjudicated, added back, no problem. But what happens instead is, because those 3% are seized upon through political animals that are looking for opportunities to sue and to turn those kinds of stories into the headlines, it really inhibits the states from removing the 97%. And that's why we have, one of the reasons that our rolls are in such abysmal shape, because they don't want to incur that wrath. So they just bury their heads and leave the rest of us, the rest of the rolls, just to flounder. And we can't have that attitude. We've got to go into this aligned, recognizing that mistakes are going to be made, but let's err on the side of getting it as right as we can.
It strikes me as kind of a double standard, because we're all having to put up with the states having inaccurate rolls, and yet they're not taking any heat for the static system that we have right now. In other words, the amount of incorrect information. And yet if we try to correct it, then all of a sudden there's a problem. Does that strike you as problematic?
Absolutely. I mean, case in point, we were involved in a 3-year-long lawsuit in Georgia. And in Georgia, what happened was we had taken a close look at the voter rolls, and interesting, just to kind of set the stage, Georgia only cleans its rolls, the state only looks at its rolls statewide once every other year in odd years in the first 6 months of the year. And so to frame that means that they in June of 2023 looked at the rolls, removed some names, and aren't going to look at it again now until the summer of 2025. Well, there's going to be an awful lot of activity in those rolls in between time, and that's all free game. That nobody's going to evaluate what's coming into those rolls for that period of time, which clearly and fundamentally is wrong. But in our assessment of the rolls, we found back in, this was in the fall and winter of 2020, because they were in between the general election and the runoff, we found that there were 364,000 ineligible records on the rolls. And of course, this was then as now in this new age of mass mail out of ballots. And so if you catalyze the mass mail out of ballots with inaccurate data, that means you've just got, ballots going out with abandon. And so the state has a process, many states in fact have a process that allows for citizens to challenge the voter rolls within the county in which they are registered. And so voters across the state worked with True the Vote. We provided them with our records. The process should have been very diplomatic, very understated. They just submit the records to the county. The county takes a look. If there was a problem, the counties could react, and they could do this individually and not outside of what the state had to do, which was, again, going back to this every other year thing. And so it was a way to hopefully move closer to a trustworthy process. Within just a couple of days of our announcing that we were doing this, Fair Fight, which is Stacey Abrams, backed by Mark Elias as their counsel, sued us, and it took 3 years to finally resolve. It ended in a trial, which we won, and they've now appealed this to the 11th Circuit. But the whole premise was that we had somehow intimidated voters in this process. What's intimidating is that hundreds of thousands of ineligible records are on the rolls. That's what's intimidating. But yet they put on the stand 2 or 3 folks that they had reached out to, people that were registered, lived in another state, still registered in Georgia, but on the stand said they had intended to move back to Georgia, and that was the basis of their case. So we really have to hold the line on the reality of, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are going to be these fringe cases. Let's look at those one by one, but manage to the greater whole. And then endure the lawfare and the wrath that comes with it until we've done it enough that the lawfare no longer comes, because the lesson over time will be we're not putting up with it. So we need more people standing in the gap and saying, this is not okay. And oftentimes True the Vote is the lone voice. We need more voices pushing back. And then this will become the new expectation and the new normal.
You know, Catherine, you talk about lawfare, and it was my next point, and I'm very concerned when I hear a story like what you just told me. The left is awash in money, and if they just go after True the Vote or any other organization they don't like enough in court, they could essentially bankrupt you. So I guess my first question is, are you going to get legal fees from them for this frivolous lawsuit? And secondly, how do we prevent them from using the law to bankrupt organizations like True the Vote?
So it's a great question, and the first part of your question, do we get fees back? We got some nominal fees like filing fees and some things like that, but that was it. Even though, as we started at the top of this interview, I told you we started True the Vote in 2009. Prior to starting True the Vote, I'd never been in court. I'd ran a company for 16 years, never had a lawsuit, never had any, legal dealings that got ugly. I just ran my business and everything was fine. After starting True the Vote, I have never been out of court. I was sued within the first 2 months of filing a nonprofit paperwork for True the Vote and have been in court ever since. And it is an everyday reality that we teeter on that brink of, is this next case going to take us out? Because these cases can run up into the 7 digits. And whenever we, anticipate a case, you have to anticipate that it's going to go all the way to the Supreme Court. And it looks, very much like this case in Georgia may do just that. I'm confident that we're going to win in the 11th Circuit. But hey, if we don't, we are prepared to move on to the Supreme Court. The only thing I know that will stop it is if we flood the system with more activists and more people speaking out about this so that this becomes the new normal. Right now, because there aren't as many organizations speaking out and we're so captive to what I call the matrix media that is out there as the propaganda for the state, pushing this narrative that somehow wanting accurate voter rolls is a bad thing. We need to, and through you and others across the country, just keep pushing out the message that no, we've got this upside down. We should expect accuracy. How has it become okay to not have accurate elections and to just sort of wink and nod that, the rolls weren't right and the process wasn't really followed, but we're going to go ahead and certify it anyway. They're counting on America to forget. And I think they pushed too far in 2020 because America hasn't forgotten. America now really questions their elections. And so it's left to groups like True the Vote and many others that are rising up, and thank God for it, to say, okay, there are problems, and now we have to fix them. Government will not fix them. It will only be because people demand it. And so we want to help them have their voices heard.
It's interesting that you talked about the 2020 elections, and I think what it's come down to now is that those of us who raise a question about the 2020 elections, and I think there are many, are called election deniers, and somehow we are ostracized and not to be listened to, and everybody has to buy into the narrative. And again, I think this goes back to the media and the cooperation between the media and the deep state. So how do we get past this term? Do we have to have our own terminology?
I think we do have to have our own terminology. It's simple. It's just the truth. I think also it is increasingly difficult to look past everything that happened in 2020, which is much bigger than just the broken process of the elections, right? It started with mass censorship that was introduced under this fog of COVID. And now that we're beginning to see more clearly what COVID was really about and the efforts to destabilize our culture through the cautionary words around the pandemic. I mean, whatever you think about the COVID pandemic as sort of its own thing, you can't help but look at the lasting impact it's left culturally in the way that we so broke apart norms, and the elections fed right into that. The censorship of anybody speaking out or sharing alternate positions, where silence were removed. That's the kind of stuff that a totalitarian state does. That's not the kind of stuff that should be happening in America. You may not like what I have to say, but I still should be able to say it. for the first time now, we're seeing writ large intentional efforts to silence any dissenting voice. That's totalitarianism, and we are perilously close. We need to stay eyes open about what this really means. It's a dystopian situation that we find ourselves in, but it's happening nonetheless. We must maintain the fight for our freedoms, for our freedom to speak freely, for our freedom to dissent and to have choice. There's a small but powerful contingent out there that doesn't want that. It's an important and a very historic time that we find all of us find ourselves in now.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues with Catherine Engelbrecht in just a moment.
Get your fix online at shillingshow.com.
ShillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
ShillingShowMedia.com will take your project from conception to completion.
ShillingShowMedia.com is reasonably priced and highly professional.
Need a website for your business? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
Need a video created or edited? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
Have a photography or graphic design project? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
ShillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
Visit ShillingShowMedia.com. That's ShillingShowMedia.com.
Looking out for us. Rob Schaub.
We're talking about fixing our broken elections with Catherine Engelbrecht, the founder of True the Vote. There's an issue that's going on here locally. We're in Virginia, near the University of Virginia, and for many years, students were not allowed to vote unless they were domiciled here. That has been done away with, and so now I understand there are websites where students can go and, let's say they live in New York and their vote's already sealed up there, they'll decide to vote in Virginia. This seems like a manipulation of the system. How do we stop that?
Yeah, this is another slippery slope because in most states, domicile is sort of a state of mind. You know, I know the website of which you refer, and yeah, you can put in the progressively oriented website and you put in where you're, you know, in the case of a college student, where you live with your parents or where you go to school, and the website will spit out where your vote is more important to advance progressive ideals. And it's just manipulation of the system, but it's, you know, right now the laws are written in such a way that as long as you don't vote twice in the same election, it's not illegal. And so there's a certain amount of good ground game that in its politics, while morally it doesn't feel like that's appropriate, it's nonetheless, you know, what one side of the equation is doing. And so the other side needs to have their case heard too, and needs to be out there on par, pointing out similar considerations. But that's not something that you see. I mean, the willingness of the progressive party to go all in and play every angle tells you a lot about their ferocity in this fight. And I think for a long time, the Republican Party broadly has just sort of relied on the belief that America is by and large a center-right country, and you know, the pendulum swings back and forth, and sometimes we win and sometimes we lose. And I think that as a nonpartisan organization, and so standing on the outside and looking in, definitely feels like one party wants the win from a technical perspective, knows how to get it by playing to the weaknesses of process. And that requires a different strategy on the other side, a strategy that we're not really seeing just yet.
We're in the midst of, or we just finished up here in Virginia, but in other places across the country, so-called early voting. We have a 45-day window in Virginia, which is absolutely ridiculous. It opens us up. It opens us up for so much fraud and for things to come out. If you cast your vote on day 45 out from the election, then somebody dies. Well, you can't get your vote back. This is such a colossally bad idea. What do we do about early voting?
You've got to have a pushback from the people, and you've got to take that through your representatives, or if your state allows for independent special interest groups to add things to the ballot. I mean, this is a law that has to be pulled back. I agree. I think it's absolutely outrageous. And I can tell you that the rest of the world looks at the way we vote in this country and thinks we have lost our minds. Most countries do not have early voting. Most countries have one election day. It's generally a national holiday. Everybody votes. If you don't get to vote sorry, too bad. I tend to go more along the lines of if you have it, if you're infirm, if you're elderly, I think that we can technologically still make some concessions for those kinds of voters without having a dip in integrity. But you look at what states like Virginia does with a 45-day early vote. That's crazy. So much can happen during that time. But the only way back is to repeal it back through the laws. We've got to follow the processes that we set in motion. It's just not fast. We live in a culture of convenience where we want our problems solved. Frankly, I think it's one of the reasons that coming out of 2020, we were so quick to just blame it all on the machines. It's all the machines. The machines do play a role. There are problems there, but it's not like there's just a man behind the curtain that is causing all of these problems. And if we can just get to that nexus, everything is solved. Our process has been eroding for decades, and it is going to take time to get it correct. But we must be dedicated to that cause.
I'd like to talk about voter ID. We're in a state, again, here in Virginia that allows me, and I tried this when it first became the law, to vote without ID. I went in, and although I had an ID, I said I want to vote without ID. I had to fill out a little affidavit. Then I was given a ballot, and it was cast. How do we go about an election system without knowing who's voting? And then how do we counter the claims of quote-unquote voter suppression?
It's a war of words. We have Merrick Garland out right now. I was speaking actually in Fannie Willis's church just this past weekend, saying that he is committed with the Department of Justice to do away with voter ID because it's racist in his view. And again, that's outrageous. And we have to be able as a community, as a people, to say it's not wrong to make sure that the voter is who they say that they are. That's common sense. And we've so lost our way with being able to positively stand for just common sense values. The only way to solve the problem is by passing laws that support voter identification. And it's something that should be standard in every state. 20-some states don't have any standard for ID. And again, it's crazy. The rest of the world has voter identification. We are the only industrialized country in the world that doesn't have a standard form of ID. But it's because we have allowed fringe groups to drive the narrative. Having done this for 15 years, I assure you, it's not always fun to be on the receiving end of lawsuits and all that goes with that. But we must persevere or we will lose our way entirely. We're perilously close now, but we must push back with just common sense. Just wake back up to common sense. It's not easy, but it has to be done.
One of the things that True the Vote is working towards is transparency in the system. And a lot of that has to do with observers and people watching. And yet there seems to be an effort to exclude certain people from seeing what's going on. Are you seeing that?
Absolutely, yes. We saw it, on tape in 2020 when Republican observers were removed from places they had every right to be. And, who can forget the images in Detroit where they put cardboard up over the windows so you couldn't even observe what was happening inside of the building. And now we are seeing legislation passed and rules put in place that restrict the speech and movement of observers in ways that prior to 2020 you would have never imagined possible. This is something that we need to get on top of now and deal with. What we tell people is not only this cycle, don't just vote, but plan to serve. And while True the Vote offers many trainings and will continue to work with people to help them know how to get involved in the process, at the end of the day, you must go and work on behalf of the party or candidate of your choice or directly with the county, and your party can typically help you with that. Not always. In certain places you have parties that aren't as strong as they ought to be in doing it, but now is the time to reach out to your election administrator locally, reach out to your party and say, hey, I want to serve in the election. What does that look like? Every state follows a different process, but now is the time. Because in the past, citizens haven't been as forthcoming in making it known that they want to serve. What that leads the jurisdictions to do is hire it out, is use staffing agencies. And believe me, that can become a political game really quick. We need to make sure that there's parity of party at the polls. That's a tongue twister, but you want to have an equal balance of Democrats and Republicans so that you have fair game inside the process. And that's something that people everywhere should pick up the phone, call their party, call their county and say, how do I serve? What is the process? Or start with going to True the Vote. We have all kinds of information on how you can get involved via the state, via the county. There's no other way back except to roll up our sleeves and get involved.
Finally, I'd like to talk about the role of the federal government versus the role of the states in elections. What does the Constitution tell us, and are we following that?
The Constitution says that it's up to the states to decide the time and place and process, and then they have guidance in place, particularly when you look at the National Voter Registration Act, which was passed in the early 90s, the Help America Vote Act, which tries to articulate more specifically around some of the securities, and then under the Obama administration, the elections were made a critical part of critical infrastructure, which put the whole process under Department of Homeland Security, which brought in a whole new section of securities that are required. There are some good things about having some level of federal oversight relative to national security, but we must be ever vigilant to avoid having the entire process become federalized. There is a delicate balance. States must retain their sovereignty in this process. If they don't do the job, it's ever easier for the federal government to say, well, we just have to make this some kind of federal standard because the states clearly can't manage it. And once you ring that bell, you can't unring it. And so while the federal government does have a role to play, it is ultimately the states that are responsible constitutionally for processing the election. You know, the most powerful layer of all is the people. People must participate so that our states stay focused, so that we can keep out of the clutches of the federal government. God forbid that our process should ever fall wholly to the federal government. There are more problems in that scenario than we have time to get into today. But I will tell you that the current administration is pushing every day in that direction.
Catherine, if people want to get more information or become involved with True the Vote, tell us how we can do that.
Absolutely. They can go to truethevote.org. You can click on Engage at the top of the website, and we'll give you all manner of ways to get involved, or click on Contact and sign up and get our newsletter so you can plug in that way. We are an incredibly active organization trying to stay ahead of the curve on all of the things that are coming at us in 2024. And there are many other great groups across the country. Just plug in. This cycle, voting is not enough. Vote and serve in some way. If we all just do a little bit, we can turn this ship around quickly, but it's going to take all of us on deck.
Catherine Engelbrecht, founder of True the Vote, you're doing such important work. We thank you for what you're doing and for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at shillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time.